Hi guys! Today, you'll drift into fascinating stories from the past. Slow, soothing tales that will calm your mind and help you enjoy a deep, restful sleep.
Genghis Khan, born as Temujin in the rugged and endless steppes of Mongolia, entered the world in the year 1162, during a time when the land was a mosaic of rival tribes, each one competing for survival in a harsh and unforgiving environment. The winds swept endlessly across the grasslands, carrying with them the scent of wild sage and the distant calls of unseen birds. Life in this place was not gentle. It demanded resilience, skill, and an unbreakable will. Temujin's early life would reflect all of these qualities, though at the time he could not have imagined the vast empire he would one day command. His father, Yesugei, was a respected chieftain of the Borjigin clan, a man who commanded loyalty through strength and cunning. Temujin's mother, Heolun, was known for her resourcefulness and determination, traits she would pass on to her son. As a boy, Temujin was taught the ways of the steppe, riding a horse before he could properly walk, learning to shoot arrows with precision while galloping at full speed, and understanding the subtle changes in the wind that could signal a shift in weather. These skills were not merely for sport. They were the keys to survival in a land where the winters could kill as easily as a sword. But Temujin's childhood was not one of uninterrupted peace. When he was still a young boy, his father was poisoned by enemies during a journey home from arranging a marriage for Temujin. The death of Yesugei shattered the fragile stability of their family. Without his father's leadership, the Borjigin clan abandoned Heolun and her children, leaving them alone in the vastness of the steppe. Food became scarce, and each day was a battle against hunger. Temujin learned quickly that trust was a rare commodity, and that one's survival often depended on personal strength and determination. Despite the hardship, these years shaped Temujin into a keen observer of human nature. He saw how loyalty could be bought, how fear could control men, and how alliances could be made and broken with the changing of the seasons. His mother's wisdom was his guide. She taught him the value of unity, the importance of keeping promises, and the necessity of adapting to the unexpected. As Temujin grew, he began to gather a small band of followers, young men who shared his vision of something greater than the endless cycle of tribal feuds. They were not bound together by blood, but by loyalty and mutual respect. This was unusual in a culture where kinship often dictated allegiance. Temujin's ability to inspire loyalty from those outside his family would become one of his most powerful tools in the years to come. This step itself seemed to whisper lessons to him. The movement of herds taught patience. The sudden storms taught caution. The quiet nights beneath the endless stars taught reflection. Temujin was not yet a conqueror, but already the seeds of leadership had taken root. Every decision he made, every alliance he forged, was a step toward a destiny he could only dimly sense. Yet destiny rarely comes without trials. Temujin was captured by the Taichiyud, one of the rival tribes, and held as a prisoner. They saw him as a threat, even in his youth. Bound in a wooden collar, he endured days and nights of humiliation and uncertainty. But even in captivity, Temujin's mind remained sharp. He watched, he waited, and he found allies among the most unlikely people. A sympathetic guard, a fellow prisoner, anyone who might help him find a way to freedom.
His escape was both daring and decisive. Under the cover of night, aided by those few who believed in him, Temujin slipped away from his captors and vanished into the vastness of the steppe. This act of defiance marked a turning point. No longer was he simply a boy surviving the harshness of the land. He was now a leader who had proven his will to overcome any obstacle. The bonds he formed in those early years became the foundation of what would one day be a vast and disciplined army. These men trusted him because they had suffered with him, fought alongside him, and seen him risk everything for their freedom. In the steppe, trust born from shared hardship was stronger than any blood tie. In time, word of Temujin's growing influence began to spread among the tribes. Some saw him as a potential ally, others viewed him as a dangerous rival. He understood that unity would be the key to survival, not just for himself, but for all the Mongol tribes. Yet unity was not easily won in a land where revenge, honor, and ancient grudges shaped the hearts of men. For now, Temujin remained patient. He built his following slowly, choosing men not for their birth or wealth, but for their loyalty and skill. He shared the spoils of every victory equally, a radical departure from the customs of many chieftains. This earned him not just loyalty, but genuine devotion. And so, on the open plains of Mongolia, beneath skies so wide they seemed to swallow the earth, the story of Genghis Khan began, not in the roar of battle, but in the quiet, determined steps of a boy becoming a leader.
Temujin's escape from the Taichiyud was not the end of his struggles. It was the beginning of a long and perilous journey toward influence. The Mongolian steppe was vast, but news traveled quickly. His enemies would soon know he was free, and many would see his return as a threat to the balance of power among the tribes. He could not simply hide, he had to act. Survival now depended not just on his skill as a warrior, but on his ability to navigate the complex web of alliances and rivalries that defined life in the steppe. He first sought out his blood brothers, men who had fought and suffered alongside him in the past. Loyalty in the steppe was fragile, but Temujin's escape had proven his resilience. Those who had once doubted his leadership now saw him as a man destined for greatness. Slowly, his small band of companions grew, joined by men from different clans who were drawn to his reputation for fairness and his vision of unity. Temujin understood that strength was not built on brute force alone. He knew the tribes had been weakened by years of constant conflict, each one raiding the other for livestock, women, and land. He saw a different future, one in which the Mongol tribes stood together against their common enemies beyond the steppe. But to make this vision a reality, he would first have to bring order to the chaos within. He began by forging alliances through marriage and diplomacy. His own marriage to Borte, a woman from the Onjirat tribe, was not only a personal choice, but a political one. The union secured him valuable allies and strengthened his position among the Mongols. Borte herself would prove to be a steadfast partner, supporting Temujin through both triumph and tragedy. The years that followed were marked by both victories and setbacks. Temujin's forces clashed with rival tribes, sometimes winning new allies, other times retreating to avoid devastating losses. He quickly learned the value of discipline in warfare, an unusual trait among the often disorganized tribal armies. Under his leadership, his men trained to fight in coordinated formations, using tactics that emphasized mobility and precision. Horseback archers became his greatest weapon, able to strike swiftly and retreat before the enemy could counter. One of Temujin's most important early victories came against the Merkit tribe, who had once kidnapped Barthay. In a swift and decisive campaign, Temujin allied with his blood brother Jamucha and his ally Togrul, the Khan of the Karaites, to rescue her. The raid was not only a personal triumph, but also a statement to all the tribes. Temujin protected those who belonged to him, and he repaid loyalty with loyalty. But alliances were fragile. His relationship with Jamucha, once as close as family, began to fracture. Jamucha favored the traditional aristocracy
of the Mongol tribes, giving power and wealth to noble families. Temujin, however, chose his commanders based on merit rather than birth. This meritocratic approach angered many nobles, but earned him the devotion of common warriors who saw in him a leader who valued skill over lineage.
The rift with Jamuka eventually led to open conflict. What began as small disputes escalated into full-scale war between their followers. The battles were fierce, and while Temujin's forces were disciplined, Jamuka still commanded greater numbers in the early stages. In one particularly brutal episode, Jamuka captured 70 of Temujin's men and executed them in a horrific manner, burning them alive. This act shocked the steppe and tarnished Jamuka's reputation, driving more men into Temujin's camp. Temujin did not forget these betrayals. He used them to fuel his determination, understanding that unity could only be achieved if the Mongols were led by a ruler who could balance justice with strength. Slowly, through both diplomacy and warfare, he expanded his influence. Every victory brought new warriors to his side, and every act of fairness reinforced his image as a leader who could be trusted. The steppe was changing. Where once there had been countless small warring tribes, now there were two clear powers, Temujin and those loyal to him, and Jamuka with his shrinking circle of allies. The winds of history were shifting, and even those who opposed Temujin could sense that his star was rising. In the quiet moments between campaigns, Temujin would sometimes ride alone into the open plains, letting the endless horizon fill his vision. He knew that his destiny was no longer just about survival or vengeance. It was about shaping the future of his people, about taking the scattered tribes and forging them into a nation that could stand against any power in the known world. The rivalry between Temujin and Jamuka intensified with each passing year. Though they had once sworn eternal brotherhood, the reality of power and ambition had turned them into bitter enemies. The steppe, vast and seemingly endless, was not large enough for two leaders of their magnitude. For Temujin, defeating Jamuka was not merely a matter of personal vengeance. It was a necessary step toward unifying the Mongol tribes under a single disciplined banner. Temujin's forces had grown stronger, not only in numbers but in organization. His warriors were divided into units of tens, hundreds, and thousands, a system that allowed for precise coordination during battle. This was a stark contrast to the often chaotic charges of other tribal armies. Orders could be relayed quickly, and the discipline of his troops made them formidable opponents. It was becoming clear to many
that Temujin was no ordinary chieftain. The conflict between the two leaders came to a decisive moment in a massive battle near the Onon River. Temujin's disciplined ranks clashed against Jamuka's numerically superior but less organized forces. Arrows darkened the sky as Mongol horsemen darted in and out of enemy lines, striking with deadly precision before retreating to safety. Temujin's strategy was to weaken his opponent through relentless harassment, avoiding direct confrontation until Jamuka's forces were exhausted. The fighting lasted for days, each side testing the other's endurance. In the end, Temujin's superior tactics forced Jamuka into retreat. Though the victory was not total, Jamuka remained alive and dangerous. It was a turning point. Many clans that had once supported Jamuka began to reconsider their allegiance. They saw in Temujin a leader who could bring not only victory, but stability.
Yet Temujin was not a man who believed victory came solely from the sword. Between battles, he worked tirelessly to strengthen bonds with allied tribes. He rewarded loyalty with generosity, sharing spoils equally among his warriors and ensuring that the families of fallen soldiers were cared for. This fostered a deep sense of trust, an invaluable asset in a land where betrayal was a constant threat. During this period, Temujin began to codify a set of laws and principles that would guide his growing coalition. Known as the Yasa, these laws covered matters of discipline, theft, and loyalty. They established strict rules for military conduct, forbade the taking of property from fellow warriors without permission, and emphasized the importance of unity. For the first time in Mongol history, there was a framework that bound tribes together beyond temporary alliances. Temujin's reputation reached beyond the Mongol tribes, drawing the attention of neighboring peoples. Some sought alliances, while others viewed him with suspicion and fear. The Jin dynasty in northern China, aware of the growing power on their frontier, began to take note of this ambitious leader. For now, Temujin's focus remained on the steppe, but his vision was beginning to extend far beyond its borders. Jamuka, though weakened, was not finished. He retreated to gather his strength, seeking new allies among tribes hostile to Temujin. The steppe braced itself for another round of conflict, as both men prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Temujin understood that to truly unite the Mongols, he would have to eliminate Jamuka as a rival once and for all. As the seasons turned, Temujin's forces continued to grow. His disciplined warriors trained relentlessly, their skills honed through constant skirmishes. Horses were the bloodline of his army. each rider maintaining several mounts to ensure speed and endurance during long campaigns. Supplies were carefully managed, and every soldier knew his place within the larger structure of the army. In the quiet of night, Temujin would sometimes reflect on how far he had come, from a boy abandoned by his clan to a leader whose name was spoken with respect and fear across the steppe. Yet he knew that the journey was far from over. Ahead lay greater battles, greater risks, and the possibility of a legacy that would outlast him. The Mongol steppe, under the cold light of the moon, seemed endless. Temujin's shadow stretched across it, a silent promise of the power yet to come.
The inevitable second clash between Temujin and Jamuka came with the thaw of spring, when the grasslands once again became rich with life and the horses regained their strength. Both leaders knew that this would not be a minor skirmish, but a decisive encounter that could alter the balance of power across the Mongolian steppe. For Temujin, it was more than a battle. It was a test of his vision for unity, discipline, and order against the old ways of tribal rivalry and privilege. Temujin's scouts reported that Jamuka had formed a coalition of tribes still loyal to the traditional aristocracy. Their numbers were significant, but their unity was fragile, held together only by a common opposition to Temujin's rise. Temujin, on the other hand, commanded fewer men, but his forces were bound by loyalty, merit, and a shared belief in his leadership. He knew that numbers alone would not determine the outcome. Strategy and discipline would. The battlefield was chosen with care, a wide open plain bordered by low hills, giving Temujin's horse archers ample room to maneuver. His plan was simple but precise: wear down Jamuka's forces with repeated hit-and-run attacks, forcing them to break formation and pursue. Once the enemy was scattered, his heavy cavalry would strike decisively. At dawn, the two armies faced each other. The air was crisp, the grass wet with dew. The silence was broken only by the restless snorting of horses and the clink of weapons. Temujin rode along the front lines, speaking to his warriors in calm, measured tones. He reminded them that this fight was not for personal revenge, but for the future of their people, for a steppe united under a single, strong hand. The battle began with a sudden rain of arrows from Temujin's mounted archers. They advanced at a gallop, loosing shafts with deadly accuracy before wheeling away to avoid direct confrontation. Jamuka's warriors gave chase, but their pursuit only played into Temujin's hands. The chase dragged them farther from their lines, stretching their formation thin. At the signal, Temujin's heavy cavalry surged forward, crashing into the disorganized enemy with devastating force. For hours, the battle raged. Dust filled the air, mingling with the cries of men and horses. Temujin's disciplined formations adapted quickly to changing circumstances, exploiting every weakness in the enemy's lines. By mid-afternoon, the tide had turned decisively in his favor. Jamukha's coalition began to collapse, warriors fleeing in all directions. The once mighty alliance that opposed Temujin was shattered. In the aftermath, Temujin faced a choice. Many of the captured warriors were from tribes that opposed him out of loyalty to their leaders rather than personal hatred. Rather than executing them, he offered them a place in his ranks, provided they swore loyalty and adhered to his laws. This act of mercy, combined with his decisive victory, cemented his reputation as a just and pragmatic leader. Jamukha himself managed to escape, but his power was broken. His remaining followers dwindled, and over time, even some of his closest allies abandoned him. Temujin, meanwhile, grew stronger with each passing season. His army swelled with new recruits, and his influence spread across the steppe. With Jamukha's threat diminished, Temujin turned his attention to consolidating his power. He continued to enforce the yasa, ensuring order not only in his army, but also in the growing network of allied tribes. Disputes were settled according to law rather than personal vendetta, and resources were distributed in a way that benefited the whole rather than enriching only the elite. This new order was unfamiliar to many, but its effectiveness was undeniable.
Temujin also began to look beyond the steppe. He saw opportunity in the rich lands to the south, where the Jin dynasty ruled over prosperous cities and fertile farmland. Trade with these territories could bring wealth, but it could also bring conflict. For now, Temujin chose patience, knowing that his strength was not yet at its peak. In the evenings, as fires burned low and the vast sky glittered with stars, Temujin would often sit with his closest companions, speaking not of conquests, but of the future. He envisioned a Mongol nation that could stand as an equal to the greatest empires of the world, a nation forged not only by war, but by shared purpose. The steppe was changing, and Temujin was its architect. Every decision, every battle, every alliance was a stone in the foundation of something greater than any one man's ambition. And though the road ahead would be long and perilous, the direction was clear. The age of scattered tribes was ending. The age of Genghis Khan was beginning. With Jamuka's power broken and the Mongol steppe slowly bending to his will, Temujin turned his eyes southward. Beyond the rolling grasslands lay the wealthy lands of the Jin dynasty, a realm of walled cities, bustling markets, and vast fields of grain. To the Mongols, these lands seemed almost like another world, a world of abundance and stability, but also one guarded by powerful armies and rigid hierarchies. Temujin understood that before he could challenge such a power, he needed to strengthen his position even further. His forces were formidable, but they lacked the siege equipment and specialized tactics needed to take fortified cities. He began by securing alliances with tribes on the southern edge of the steppe, whose people had more frequent contact with the sedentary cultures beyond. These alliances not only expanded his manpower, but also brought valuable knowledge about customs, trade routes, and defenses of the Jin. Trade caravans began to move under Temujin's protection. Merchants paid tribute in exchange for safe passage across the dangerous steppes, and in return, Temujin gained access to foreign goods, silks, grain, weapons, and even rare luxuries like fine tea and spices. These exchanges also brought intelligence, as traders carried news and rumors from distant lands. One of the most significant developments of this period was Temujin's growing relationship with the Ongarat and Karayat tribes, both of which held strategic positions along the borders with the Jin. The Karayat, led by his old ally Torul, offered him a bridge to the outside world, and together they began to consider joint campaigns that could bring wealth to both. But even as Temujin planned for expansion, the steppe remained a place of shifting loyalties. Some tribes resented his growing power, fearing that he would one day rule as a tyrant. Rebellions flared from time to time, forcing him to split his attention between diplomacy and warfare. His response was swift and measured. He crushed uprisings with decisive force, but whenever possible, he spared the lives of those who submitted afterward, offering them a place within his ranks. This blend of firmness and mercy continued to win him followers. By this time, Temujin's military reforms had transformed the Mongol way of war. The decimal organization of tens, hundreds, and thousands was firmly in place, allowing for quick and coordinated movements across great distances. Communication relied on a network of mounted messengers who could carry orders faster than most armies could march. Supply lines were carefully maintained, and warriors were trained to live off the land when necessary, making them less dependent on slow-moving baggage trains. The first direct contact with the Jin came not as an invasion, but as a series of border raids. These were calculated strikes meant to test the enemy's strength, gather resources, and learn about their tactics. Temujin personally oversaw some of these expeditions, riding alongside his men as they swept into enemy territory, seizing cattle and goods before vanishing back into the steppe. The Jin commanders, used to fighting other sedentary states, struggled to respond to the speed and unpredictability of the Mongol cavalry. These early encounters taught Temujin valuable lessons. He saw that while the Jin armies were disciplined and well-equipped, they were slower to adapt, their movements hindered by the need to protect supply wagons and maintain rigid formations. Against the mobility of the Mongols, such rigidity was a weakness he could exploit. Temujin's ambitions, however, went beyond simple raiding. He envisioned a day when his banners would fly not only over the steppe, but over the cities of the south. For this, he began to experiment with new tactics, capturing skilled artisans from conquered settlements to build siege engines, studying the construction of city walls, and gathering intelligence on the Jin's internal politics. By now, his name carried weight far beyond Mongol lands. Envoys from distant tribes and even from foreign states came to meet him, some seeking alliances, others hoping to dissuade him from expansion. Temujin listened to them all, but his plans remained his own, known only to his most trusted companions. As summer turned to autumn, Temujin gathered his leaders for a great council. They sat together in a large yurt, the air thick with the scent of burning incense and strong tea. Maps were unrolled, strategies debated, and decisions made that would shape the coming years. Temujin's voice was calm but firm as he laid out his vision. First, to unite the entire steppe under his rule, then to turn south and challenge the Jin dynasty itself. Outside, the wind swept across the plains, carrying with it the cries of distant cranes and the rustle of tall grass. The steppe seemed to listen, as if aware that the plans made in that yurt would change its history forever.
The decision to challenge the Jin dynasty was not made lightly. Temujin knew that the southern empire possessed vast resources, disciplined armies, and fortified cities unlike anything the Mongols had faced before. But he also knew that the Jin were burdened by internal divisions, court intrigues, and a sense of security that made them slow to adapt to unconventional threats. He intended to exploit these weaknesses with the precision of a hunter stalking prey. The first large-scale campaign began in the early spring, when the rivers thawed and the grass grew thick enough to sustain the horses. Temujin's army moved swiftly, advancing in multiple columns to confuse the enemy about his true objective. His goal was not immediate conquest, but disruption, to strike deep into Jin territory, destroy key outposts, seize resources, and retreat before the enemy could muster a coordinated response. His forces struck with speed and ferocity. Villages along the frontier were taken before their garrisons could organize. Storehouses were emptied, and herds were driven back to the steppe. The Mongol warriors, accustomed to living off minimal supplies, were unburdened by the long baggage trains that slowed the Jin armies. Each man carried what he needed, and the horses, hardened by the rigors of the steppe, could endure long marches without faltering. The Jin commanders responded with caution, sending out patrols and attempting to predict the Mongols' movements, but Temujin's tactics confounded them. He divided his forces into smaller units that could strike independently, vanish, and then reunite miles away. The enemy never knew where he would appear next. This unpredictability became his greatest weapon, undermining the Jin's ability to mount an effective defense. During one such raid, Temujin captured an important frontier town. Rather than simply plundering it, he ordered that skilled craftsmen, blacksmiths, and siege engineers be spared and taken north. These men would teach the Mongols the arts of building siege engines and fortifications, knowledge that would one day prove vital in capturing walled cities. Despite the campaign's successes, Temujin was careful not to overextend. The Jin dynasty, though momentarily unsettled, could still bring overwhelming force to bear if provoked too far. After several months of continuous raids, he withdrew his forces to the steppe, allowing them to rest, regroup, and integrate the new skills they had acquired.
This period marked a transformation in the Mongol army. No longer were they merely masters of open-field warfare. They were beginning to develop the means to challenge fortified settlements. Captured engineers taught them how to construct trebuchets, battering rams, and siege towers. Temujin insisted that his warriors learn these techniques as thoroughly as they had mastered the bow and the saddle. Meanwhile, the raids into Jin territory had another effect: fear. Stories of Mongol speed and ruthlessness spread across the empire, carried by fleeing refugees and demoralized soldiers. Some border officials began to pay tribute in secret, hoping to avoid destruction. Temujin accepted such arrangements when they served his purposes, using them to gather intelligence
and secure safe passage for his scouts. Back on the steppe, the spoils of the campaign were distributed according to Temujin's strict code. Every warrior received a share, and the families of the fallen were compensated from the common stock. This fairness reinforced the loyalty of his men, many of whom had never known such equitable treatment under other leaders. As autumn approached, Temujin convened another council of his commanders. This time, the discussion centered not only on the Jin, but also on the Western tribes and distant powers that might threaten his growing empire. He spoke of a future in which the Mongols would not merely raid the rich lands beyond their borders, but rule them. His tone was calm, but his words carried the weight of certainty. That winter, while the snow lay deep across the steppe, his warriors trained relentlessly. They practiced coordinated assaults, the use of siege equipment, and the integration of cavalry with infantry. Temujin knew that the next campaign would not be a mere raid. It would be the beginning of a true war of conquest. The fires in the Mongol camps burned brightly against the cold night. Above them the stars glittered, the same stars that had watched over Temujin as a boy, and now shone upon him as the leader of a people on the cusp of empire. The steppe was quiet, but in that silence lay the promise of thunder yet to come.
The following year, Temujin prepared for an undertaking unlike any he had attempted before. A full-scale siege of a major Jin dynasty city. His previous campaigns had taught him the value of speed and maneuver, but cities demanded patience, engineering skill, and a different kind of discipline. This would be the first test of the siegecraft knowledge his people had recently acquired. The target was a well-defended trade hub near the border, a city whose walls of packed earth and timber rose high above the surrounding plain. It was a place of considerable wealth, with bustling markets, granaries stocked with food, and a garrison trained to repel attackers. Taking it would not only provide resources, but also send a message to the Jin that the Mongols were no longer content with raiding alone. Temujin began by gathering his forces in secrecy. Scouts fanned out to monitor the city's supply routes and locate hidden paths through the surrounding terrain. Engineers, both Mongol and captured specialists, worked night and day to prepare siege equipment. Tall ladders, heavy rams, and crude trebuchets capable of hurling stones over the walls.
The army moved into position under the cover of darkness, surrounding the city before the defenders could call for reinforcements. At dawn, the siege began. Mongol horse archers rode close to the walls, unloosing arrows to harass the defenders and force them to stay under cover. Behind them, teams of engineers assembled siege engines, their movements protected by shields made from rawhide stretched over wooden frames. From within the city, the defenders answered with arrows, rocks, and pots of boiling water, but Temujin's forces pressed on. For days, the two sides tested each other's resolve. The Mongols launched probing assaults, looking for weak points in the walls, while their trebuchets pounded the gates and towers. At night, sappers crept forward to undermine the foundations, hoping to collapse sections of the wall. The defenders countered with sorties, attempting to set the siege equipment on fire. But each time the Mongols drove them back. Temujin himself moved constantly among his men, offering encouragement and ensuring discipline. He knew that sieges could sap morale quickly, especially among warriors accustomed to the open steppe. To keep spirits high, he maintained strict order in the camp, ensured regular distribution of food, and rotated units between the front lines and reserve positions. After 2 weeks, the first major breakthrough came when a section of the outer wall, weakened by repeated bombardment, crumbled under the weight of an assault. Mongol warriors surged through the gap, clashing with defenders in the narrow streets beyond. The fighting was fierce and chaotic, with arrows whistling overhead and the clang of steel echoing off the walls. Progress was slow, but Temujin had no intention of retreating. The defenders retreated to the inner citadel, a fortified complex within the city. Here, the siege entered its most grueling phase. The Mongols built additional siege towers to bring their archers level with the defenders, while engineers worked on a massive battering ram to breach the citadel gates. The constant noise of construction and the relentless pressure wore down the defenders' will.
Finally, after more than a month of siege, the gates of the citadel splintered under the pounding of the ram. The Mongols poured in, overwhelming the exhausted defenders. Temujin ordered that the civilian population be spared, a calculated act meant to contrast his leadership with the cruelty of other conquerors. Skilled artisans were identified and sent north, while the city's stores of grain, cloth, and metal were carefully inventoried and distributed. The fall of the city sent shockwaves through the Jin borderlands. Never before had a steppe army taken such a fortified position with such efficiency. Temujin's reputation, already formidable, now took on an almost mythic quality. To his followers, this victory proved that no wall was too high, no gate too strong to resist the will of the Mongols. That winter, the army returned to the steppe, laden with spoils and strengthened by new knowledge. Siegecraft was no longer a borrowed art. It was becoming a Mongol skill, refined and adapted to their unique style of warfare. And for Temujin, the siege had confirmed what he had long suspected. The Jin dynasty was vulnerable, and the day would come when the Mongol banners would fly over its capital.
The victory at the border city had emboldened Temujin's ambitions. No longer was he merely the leader of a nomadic confederation. He was becoming the architect of an empire. His council of generals began to speak openly of campaigns that would reach the heartlands of the Jin dynasty, seizing its wealth and reshaping the balance of power across Asia. Preparation for such an endeavor required more than raw courage. Temujin ordered a thorough reorganization of the army, dividing it into precise units of tens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s. This decimal system ensured that every man knew his place, his commander, and his responsibilities. It also allowed orders to pass swiftly through the ranks, a crucial advantage in the complex maneuvers that lay ahead. Diplomatic envoys were dispatched across the steppe and beyond. Some went to the Uyghur kingdom, whose literate administrators could provide the Mongols with record-keeping and logistical expertise. Others traveled westward to secure the loyalty, or at least the neutrality, of distant tribes. Temujin understood that his empire would need more than warriors. It would require scribes, merchants, engineers, and a steady flow of supplies. In the spring, the Mongol army advanced once more into Jin territory, this time in greater numbers than ever before. Temujin employed a strategy of simultaneous offensives, sending multiple armies deep into enemy lands, each moving along different routes but converging on key targets. The intent was to stretch the Jin defenses thin
forcing them to choose which cities to save and which to abandon. The campaign's first major objective was a chain of fortified towns guarding the approaches to the rich agricultural valleys of northern China. Rather than attacking them in a single massive assault, Temujin used deception. One force would threaten a city, drawing its garrison into a defensive stance, while another force bypassed it entirely to strike deeper into the countryside. These maneuvers created confusion among the Jin commanders, who often found themselves reacting to attacks that had already shifted elsewhere. The Mongols' mobility was unmatched. Warriors carried dried meat and fermented mare's milk, allowing them to travel without relying on local supplies. Each man had multiple horses, switching mounts to preserve their stamina. This enabled the army to move at a pace the Jin could not match, appearing unexpectedly at distant points and vanishing just as quickly. One particularly daring maneuver saw a Mongol detachment feign retreat before a pursuing Jin army, leading them into an ambush in a narrow valley. From the ridges above, Mongol archers rained arrows upon the trapped soldiers, while cavalry charged from both ends. The rout was complete, and the survivors fled in disarray, leaving behind their supplies and weapons. By summer, Mongol banners flew over vast stretches of the Jin frontier. Granaries were seized, tribute was collected, and local populations were brought under Mongol control, sometimes through force, but often through negotiated submission. Temujin's policy was clear. Those who surrendered would be spared and even rewarded, while those who resisted would face swift and decisive destruction. But even as his armies triumphed, Temujin kept a watchful eye on the political landscape. The Jin dynasty was not yet broken, and its rulers could still muster large armies if given time. Worse still, internal rivalries among the Mongol leadership threatened unity. Temujin worked tirelessly to maintain discipline, rewarding loyalty and punishing insubordination, for he knew that a single fracture in his command could unravel years of conquest. By the campaign's end, the Mongols had secured control of vast new territories and weakened the Jin's ability to wage war. The stage was set for an even greater offensive, one that would strike at the very core of the Jin dynasty's power. The dream of a united empire, stretching from the steppes to the heart of China, was no longer a distant vision. It was becoming a reality, forged in the dust of the battlefield and the unyielding will of its leader. The Jin dynasty's northern defenses had never faced such relentless pressure.
In the past, raids from the steppe had come and gone like sudden storms, vanishing before the court in Zhongdu could respond. But Temujin's campaigns were different, methodical, unending, and strategically precise. By the start of the next campaign season, the Mongols had already gathered intelligence on the location of key supply depots, river crossings, and garrisons. Temujin knew that the destruction of these lifelines would cripple the Jin's ability to resist. The first target was a major granary city on the banks of the Yellow River. Unlike the smaller frontier towns, this city was a logistical hub, feeding entire armies. The approach was swift and calculated. While one army demonstrated to the east, creating the illusion of a large-scale invasion, another force moved under cover of night to cross the river upstream. Using hastily constructed rafts and commandeered fishing boats, they ferried men, horses, and siege equipment across before the defenders realized their intent. At dawn, the attack began. Mongol archers unleashed volleys at the walls, forcing defenders to keep their heads down, while sappers approached with long poles tipped with burning oil-soaked cloth. Siege ladders rose, and within hours the outer defenses were breached. The fighting within the city was fierce, street by street, courtyard by courtyard, but the momentum was with the Mongols. By nightfall, the granary was in their hands, and the stores of rice and wheat were swiftly loaded onto carts for transport north. This victory was followed by a daring thrust toward the Great Wall itself. The massive fortification, a symbol of Chinese resilience, was not an unbroken barrier, but a network of walls, watchtowers, and passes. Temujin understood that its strength depended on the garrisons manning it. If those garrisons were drawn away, the wall became little more than stone and timber.
To achieve this, he ordered feigned attacks along multiple points, drawing the Jin forces to the east. Meanwhile, a smaller, elite force slipped through an unguarded mountain pass in the west, descending into the fertile plains beyond. The towns they struck were unprepared, their defenders absent, and the Mongols moved with such speed that messengers to the Jin capital could not outrun them. One of the most audacious moments came when Temujin himself led a detachment into a heavily fortified pass that had long been considered impenetrable. Using ropes and climbing spikes, His warriors scaled the cliffs at night, bypassing the main gate entirely. By dawn, the defenders awoke to find Mongol banners flying above their walls.
With the passes open, Mongol cavalry poured into the interior, striking deep into the Jin heartlands. Temujin's policy of calculated mercy was applied once again. Towns that surrendered were spared and integrated into his growing administrative network, while those that resisted were made examples of. The result was a wave of panic that spread faster than the Mongol advance itself. Yet Temujin did not underestimate his enemy. He knew the Jin court would eventually rally, perhaps calling on allied states for aid. For now, his goal was not to capture Zhongdu outright, but to weaken it through isolation. By cutting off trade routes, seizing food supplies, and controlling river crossings, he sought to make the capital a ripe target for the campaigns to come. By the campaign's end, the Mongols had secured control over key sections of the Great Wall and established forward bases within striking distance of the Jin capital. For the first time, the rulers of Zhongdu faced the very real possibility that the steppe horsemen could ride through their gates.
The Jin capital of Zhongdu loomed as both a symbol and a challenge. Its towering walls, reinforced gates, and surrounding network of fortresses had withstood generations of conflict. But Temujin understood that no fortress, however mighty, could survive without food, allies, and morale. His next move would be a campaign of deliberate preparation, tightening a noose that would strangle the city before the first siege engine was built. The Mongols began by securing the countryside. Cavalry patrols fanned out, intercepting caravans and river barges bound for the capital. Grain shipments from the south were seized, livestock driven north, and skilled artisans relocated under Mongol supervision. Without firing a single arrow at Zhongdu's walls, Temujin was already eroding its strength. Winter brought a new advantage. Frozen rivers became highways for cavalry, enabling swift strikes into areas the Jin had believed safe. Mongol horsemen appeared like phantoms, looting supply depots and vanishing into the snow before the defenders could muster a response. Each raid was calculated, not simply to gain resources, but to instill fear and uncertainty in the population. Temujin's network of informants inside the Jin territories grew. Some were merchants who had long traded with the steppe. Others were disaffected officials willing to sell information in exchange for safety. From them, the Mongols learned which gates were poorly guarded, which commanders were unpopular, and where political factions within the court were undermining the war effort. Meanwhile, siege preparations began in earnest. Timber from conquered lands was gathered, iron was smelted, and engineers from captured cities were tasked with constructing massive siege towers, catapults, and rams. Temujin did not intend to hurl his men against the walls recklessly. He would bring overwhelming force, both physical and psychological. In the spring, the Mongols struck at a series of satellite fortresses surrounding Zhongdu. Each one served as a vital link in the capital's defense, providing safe refuge for troops and controlling access to key roads. The assaults were swift and merciless, siege engines battering gates while volleys of arrows kept defenders pinned. Once breached, the fortresses were burned to prevent their reuse, and surviving defenders were scattered or absorbed into Mongol ranks. The Jin court, desperate to halt the advance, sent envoys to negotiate. They offered tribute, gold, silk, and even princesses in marriage. Temujin listened, accepted the tribute, and agreed to a temporary truce. But the peace was an illusion. Behind the scenes, he continued his preparations, using the pause to repair equipment, rest his troops, and expand his intelligence network.
When the truce ended, the Mongol army returned with renewed vigor. This time, they aimed directly at cutting off Zhongdu from its last remaining lifelines. Southern roads were blocked, river crossings seized, and allied tribes in the west were persuaded or coerced into harassing any Jin reinforcements. The capital was now a city under siege in all but name. Inside Zhongdu, food prices soared. Panic spread among the people, and whispers of surrender began to circulate. The Jin emperor ordered stricter punishments for dissent, but this only deepened the resentment. Temujin, ever the strategist, ensured that surrendered towns nearby were treated generously, their people fed and protected. Refugees fleeing the capital carried tales of Mongol mercy, contrasted sharply with the hardships inside the city walls. By summer, the stage was set. The Jin capital stood isolated, its defenses weakened by hunger, its people weary, and its rulers increasingly desperate. The coming siege would be the most ambitious operation Temujin had ever attempted, and its outcome would determine the fate of northern China.
The spring sun rose over the plains surrounding Zhongdu, casting long shadows across the vast Mongol encampment. Rows upon rows of yurts, siege engines, and tethered horses stretched to the horizon. To the citizens within the city, It was as if an entire nation had arrived at their gates. Temujin's strategy was clear: to break the capital's spirit before breaking its walls. The encirclement was complete, with Mongol patrols controlling every road and river crossing. Even the smallest attempt to smuggle food into the city was met with swift interception. Scouts reported that within Zhongdu, the markets were nearly empty, and desperate citizens were already slaughtering their livestock. The first stage of the siege was psychological warfare. At night, drums beat in a slow, relentless rhythm, echoing against the city's walls. Fires burned in the Mongol camp, their flickering light making it clear just how many warriors stood ready beyond the gates. Occasionally, riders would approach within bowshot, loosing arrows tipped with messages promising mercy to those who surrendered and destruction to those who resisted. The Jin defenders, though disciplined, could not ignore the growing fear among the populace. As days turned to weeks, hunger began to gnaw at their resolve. Bread became a luxury, rice a treasure. Whispers of cannibalism in the poorest quarters reached even the emperor's ears.
Meanwhile, the Mongols maintained their strength. Supply lines from the north and from conquered towns kept the army well fed and equipped. Siege engineers worked tirelessly, building massive towers taller than the city's battlements. Catapults capable of hurling stones the size of millstones, and rams with iron-shod heads. When the bombardment began, it was relentless. Day after day, the thud of catapult stones smashing into the walls shook the city. Arrows rained down in waves, keeping defenders from repairing breaches. The Mongols targeted not only the fortifications, but also morale. Catapults hurled severed heads of captured soldiers back into the city as a grim message. The defenders responded with their own siege engines, and for a time the air above Zhongdu was thick with projectiles from both sides. But the Mongols had the advantage in both numbers and logistics. Each damaged machine was quickly repaired or replaced, while the Jin struggled to conserve their dwindling ammunition. Temujin's commanders proposed a direct assault, but he resisted. Patience was his weapon. The longer the siege dragged on, the weaker the enemy became, and the more likely they were to break without excessive Mongol losses. Instead, he ordered repeated feigned attacks to keep the defenders on edge,
forcing them to expend their strength, repelling threats that never fully materialized.
Summer heat replaced spring rains, and with it came disease. The stench of unburied bodies and waste filled the streets of Zhongdu. Desperation led to riots among the citizens, which the imperial guard crushed brutally. But each crackdown only deepened the resentment toward the ruling court. Finally, after months of attrition, cracks appeared in the city's unity. Several high-ranking officials secretly sent envoys to Temujin, offering to open certain gates in exchange for their own safety. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Before dawn on the chosen day, Mongol forces surged toward the eastern gate, while another contingent launched a diversionary attack on the western wall. Amid the chaos, the traitorous officials fulfilled their promise, and the gates swung open. Mongol cavalry poured into the city, their advance swift and overwhelming. By midday, the imperial palace was surrounded. The emperor and his closest advisors were captured, while the rest of the city descended into chaos. Temujin, true to his calculated approach, ordered the sparing of civilians who surrendered, though much of Zhongdu was looted and burned in the aftermath. The fall of Zhongdu marked a turning point, not just in Temujin's campaign against the Jin, but in the history of China itself. The Mongols now held the heart of the north, and from this position of power, Temujin's ambitions would only grow. The smoke of Zhongdu's burning markets still curled into the sky days after the final battle. The once proud capital, center of the Jin dynasty's northern realm, now lay in ruins, its streets choked with rubble, its gates splintered, and its palaces stripped of gold and silk. Yet amidst the destruction, Temujin moved with deliberate purpose. He understood that conquest was only half the task. Control, stability, and loyalty would determine whether his victory lasted. His first decree was pragmatic. Those who had surrendered early and offered no resistance were spared from further harm. Mongol guards escorted groups of civilians to safe quarters, ensuring food was distributed to prevent rebellion born from starvation. This calculated mercy served two purposes. It reduced the need for constant military enforcement and spread the word that obedience to the Khan meant survival. High-ranking Jin officials who had betrayed their emperor were rewarded with positions under Mongol oversight. Temujin valued loyalty to himself above past alliances. Those who could administer cities,
manage taxation, or maintain trade routes were essential tools in solidifying his new territory. But such rewards came with chains. Each collaborator was closely watched by trusted Mongol officers, ensuring that their loyalty did not waver.
The city itself was divided into zones. The palace district became a Mongol administrative center, housing Temujin's commanders, scribes, and envoys. The wealthiest merchant courtier was stripped of its treasures, which were catalogued and sent north to supply future campaigns. The artisan quarters were preserved. Smiths, carpenters, and stonemasons were too valuable to destroy. Many were relocated to Mongol lands, bringing their skills to the steppe. Temujin also sought to integrate his new subjects into the broader Mongol system. He ordered the reopening of key trade roads and markets, guarded by mixed patrols of Mongol warriors and local troops. This not only restored the flow of goods, but also symbolized a new order under his rule. Those who once feared the nomadic conquerors now saw them as the guarantors of stability, at least for the moment. The fall of Zhongdu reverberated across the region. Neighboring states and tribal confederations, seeing the might of the Mongol war machine, sent envoys bearing tribute in hopes of avoiding similar fates. Silk, horses, gold, and even exotic animals arrived in the Mongol camp. Temujin received each gift with measured gratitude, offering alliances to those who submitted and thinly veiled threats to those who hesitated. Despite the triumph, Temujin was not blinded by victory. He knew the Jin dynasty still controlled vast southern territories, and their court would rally in the fortified cities beyond the Yellow River. The conquest of northern China was a step, not the end. The Mongol army needed rest, supplies, and careful planning before pushing deeper into enemy lands.
For the people of Zhongdu, life settled into an uneasy rhythm. Markets reopened, taxes were collected, and public punishments ensured order. Mongol patrols enforced curfews, while spies rooted out dissent. Over time, some locals began to prosper under the new system, trading with the Mongol garrisons and benefiting from the security they brought. Others nursed silent resentment, waiting for the day they might rise again. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Temujin rode through the city's main thoroughfare. His horse's hooves echoed against the stone as he surveyed the once mighty capital. In his eyes, this was more than a victory. It was a declaration to the world. The Mongols were no longer just riders of the steppe. They were rulers of cities, shapers of empires. From Zhongdu, Temujin sent letters and messengers across his expanding dominion, proclaiming himself the master of the northern lands. It was here, in the aftermath of the city's fall, that the legend of Genghis Khan began to spread beyond the steppe, reaching the courts of Persia, the markets of Samarkand, and even the ports of distant Europe. The empire was still young, but the foundations were set. Zhongdu had fallen, and with it an old order had been shattered. In its place a new power was rising, one that would not stop at rivers, mountains, or oceans.
The victory at Zhongdu had given Temujin not only territory, but also a strategic advantage. With the northern heartland of the Jin dynasty under Mongol control, the path toward the richer, more fertile lands of the south was open. Yet Temujin knew that rushing into the next campaign without preparation would be folly. Winter approached, bringing icy winds that swept across the plains and into the ruined streets of Zhongdu. The Mongol army, hardened to the cold, still needed shelter and provisions. Temujin ordered his forces to spread across the newly conquered territory, wintering in key towns and villages while maintaining strict discipline. Garrisons were established along major roads to secure supply lines and keep the local population in check. Diplomatic efforts ran parallel to military preparations. Envoys traveled to neighboring states, reaffirming alliances or issuing demands for tribute. Temujin understood that every alliance, however temporary, meant one less enemy to face when the great southern campaign began. Even some of the Jin dynasty's former vassals, sensing the shifting balance of power, pledged loyalty to the Khan in exchange for protection. Logistics became the central focus. Grain from the conquered farmlands was collected and stored in massive depots, guarded by elite troops. Horses, thousands upon thousands of them, were bred, trained, and rotated to ensure the cavalry would be fresh when the march began. Smiths worked day and night forging arrowheads, spear points, and replacement parts for siege engines. The campaign against the southern Jin would require more than speed. It would demand the ability to break through fortified cities, just as they had done at Zhongdu. While the army rested, Temujin held councils with his most trusted generals. Subutai, ever the master strategist, suggested a multi-pronged approach, striking at several targets simultaneously to stretch the Jin defenses thin. Jebe, the arrow,
favored lightning raids deep into enemy territory to sow panic and force the Jin court to defend multiple fronts. Temujin listened to every proposal, weighing each against the realities of terrain, weather, and the will of his warriors. Spies and scouts played a vital role during this time. Disguised as traders or pilgrims, they infiltrated the southern cities, gathering information about fortifications, troop movements, and political divisions within the Jin court. Reports came back of famine in certain provinces, corruption among officials, and unrest among the common people, all weaknesses the Khan intended to exploit.
But not all challenges came from without. Managing a vast, newly conquered territory brought its own risks. Tribal rivalries, old grudges, and the temptations of plunder threatened the discipline of the Mongol forces. Temujin enforced his laws with uncompromising severity. Looting without permission, mistreating civilians, or disobeying orders were punishable by death. These strict measures kept the army focused on the greater goal rather than personal gain. By early spring, the preparations were complete. The Mongol banners stored through the winter were once again raised. The army gathered like a tide, ready to sweep southward, their ranks disciplined, their horses restless. Each warrior knew that the coming campaign would not only test their skill, but also shape the destiny of the empire.
On the eve of departure, Temujin addressed his warriors from a hill overlooking the camp. The fires of thousands of yurts flickered in the darkness, and the night air carried the smell of wood smoke and horse sweat. His voice carried over the assembled host as he spoke of unity, destiny, and the will of the eternal blue sky. The South was rich, he said, but it was also where the Jin emperor still clung to power. Only by breaking him completely could the Mongols claim true victory. At dawn, the army moved out, columns of horsemen stretching for miles, siege wagons creaking under their load, and scouts riding ahead like shadows. The southern lands awaited, and with them the next great chapter in the rise of Genghis Khan. The march south began under skies heavy with the promise of rain. Spring on the plains was unpredictable. One day clear and bright, the next drowned in sudden storms. Yet the Mongol columns moved with steady precision, their discipline honed over years of campaigning. Scouts ranged far ahead, mapping rivers, fords, and the positions of Jin outposts. The first resistance came not from the main Jin army, but from small fortified towns along the borderlands. These garrisons, though isolated, were well defended with stone walls and crossbow towers. Temujin chose to strike swiftly. Siege engines, hauled south during the winter preparations, were assembled with practiced speed. Heavy bolts and stones smashed into the walls, while cavalry circled the perimeter to cut off any escape. Within days, the first town fell, its gates splintered and defenders cut down or captured. These early victories served a dual purpose. They secured supply routes deeper into Jin territory and sent a clear message: resistance would be crushed without mercy. News of the Mongols' approach spread ahead of the army, carried by fleeing refugees and terrified merchants. Some towns surrendered at the mere sight of the black horsehair banners. Others prepared to fight, hoping to delay the inevitable.
Further south, the Jin court was in disarray. Reports of the Mongol advance conflicted. Some claimed the invaders numbered only a few thousand. Others swore they were an endless tide. The emperor's advisors argued over strategy. Some urged the concentration of forces in a few strong cities, while others called for mobile armies to harass the Mongols in the open field. In the end, both approaches were attempted, leading to a fractured defense. It was during this confusion that the first significant field battle of the southern campaign occurred. A Jin general, tasked with halting the Mongols before they reached the richer river valleys, gathered an army of mixed infantry, cavalry, and war wagons. He positioned his forces along a narrow pass between two low hills, believing the terrain would slow the Mongol charge. Temujin studied the ground carefully before committing his troops. Rather than launching a direct assault, he ordered a feigned retreat. Light cavalry engaged the Jin front, losing arrows before turning and riding away in apparent disorder. The Jin forces, convinced they had broken the enemy's will, surged forward in pursuit, only to be met by hidden Mongol cavalry units waiting on the flanks. The trap closed with devastating speed. Arrows rained down from both sides, and panic spread through the Jin ranks. War wagons became bottlenecks as soldiers tried to retreat, only to find their path blocked. Within hours, the battle was decided. Survivors were scattered, their supplies seized, and the pass lay open to the Mongol advance. In the aftermath,
Temujin ensured that the captured supplies were distributed among his troops and that any usable weapons were added to the Mongol arsenal. Prisoners were divided. Those with valuable skills were kept alive, while others were released to spread word of the Mongol victory. Fear, Temujin knew, was a weapon as sharp as any sword. With the pass secured, the Mongol army pushed deeper into the southern lands. The rich farmlands ahead promised food for the horses and men alike, but Temujin's gaze was fixed on a far greater prize, the heart of the southern Jin territories, where their emperor still clung to his throne. The real test of the campaign had yet to come. The deeper the Mongols rode into the southern Jin lands, the richer and more heavily defended the cities became. After the victory in the mountain pass, Temujin set his sights on one of the region's greatest urban strongholds, Shangyang, a city of thick stone walls, watchtowers, and a river that flowed like a moat along its southern edge. The city's location made it both a strategic barrier and a tempting prize. Whoever held Shangyang controlled the trade routes and river crossings for hundreds of miles. When the Mongol scouts returned with detailed maps and reports, Temujin studied them in silence. The walls were high, the gates reinforced with iron, and the defenders well supplied. A direct assault would be costly, so he devised a plan to surround the city completely, cutting off all contact with the outside world. The siege began with the construction of encampments on all sides of the city. Each position was fortified with wooden palisades and watchtowers to guard against sudden sorties from the defenders. Mongol engineers began assembling trebuchets and catapults, while teams of laborers dug trenches to channel the flow of the nearby river, hoping to flood parts of the wall's foundation. Inside Xiangyang, the defenders worked tirelessly. Bells rang out to signal the approach of enemy siege engines, and archers patrolled the walls day and night. The city's commander, a seasoned veteran of past wars, knew that surrender would mean death or slavery for his people. He ordered counterattacks, small groups of soldiers rushing out at night to burn Mongol siege towers or capture supplies. These raids inflicted some damage, but the Mongols adapted quickly, setting double guards and using hidden pit traps around their camp perimeters. The days turned into weeks. Stones from the Mongol trebuchets slammed into the city walls, sending clouds of dust and shards of rock into the air. The defenders responded with their own catapults, launching fire pots into the Mongol camps. The night sky often glowed orange as fires broke out,
only to be extinguished by disciplined bucket chains. Temujin himself moved between the siege camps, ensuring morale remained high and discipline unbroken. He reminded his warriors that patience was as much a weapon as the bow. The longer the siege lasted, the weaker the defenders would become. Hunger, thirst, and disease would do what arrows could not. After nearly 2 months, the signs of strain within Xiangyang became clear. Refugees attempted to slip out under cover of darkness, only to be intercepted by Mongol patrols. Reports from captured messengers revealed that food stocks were running low and the river blockade had cut off their main supply line. Still, the commander refused to surrender.
Temujin decided the time had come for the final blow. Under his orders, siege towers taller than the city walls were rolled forward, covered in wet hides to protect them from fire. From these towers, archers rained arrows down onto the defenders, forcing them to take cover. At the same time, sappers tunneled beneath a section of the wall, planting wooden supports soaked in oil. Once set alight, the supports burned quickly, causing the stone above to crumble. At dawn, a deafening crack signaled the breach. Mongol cavalry surged through the gap, cutting down defenders in the streets. Fighting raged for hours, but the outcome was inevitable. By nightfall, Xiangyang was in Mongol hands. Temujin ordered the city's craftsmen, scholars, and merchants spared, knowing their skills would serve the empire. The rest were either absorbed into the Mongol ranks or dispersed to other conquered lands. With Xiangyang secured, the road deeper into the Jin heartland lay open, and the southern campaign entered its most decisive phase. The fall of Xiangyang sent shockwaves through the southern territories of the Jin Empire. News of the city's capture traveled faster than the Mongol cavalry, carried by merchants, fleeing refugees, and even defectors eager to gain favor with Temujin. In every market, in every village square, whispers grew into shouts. The Mongols were unstoppable. In the Jin capital, the court descended into chaos. Ministers argued bitterly over the next steps. Some demanded that the emperor sue for peace, offering gold, tribute, and even hostages in exchange for the army's withdrawal. Others called for total war, urging the mobilization of every able-bodied man to defend the southern heartland. The emperor, torn between pride and pragmatism, hesitated. His indecision only deepened the crisis. Meanwhile, in the countryside, panic took hold. Farmers abandoned their fields, driving livestock into the hills in hopes of escaping the approaching army. Entire villages emptied overnight, their homes left to be looted by bandits or claimed by Mongol foraging parties. Roads became clogged with refugees, slowing the movement of Jin supply convoys and scattering the empire's defenses.
Temujin, ever the strategist, understood the power of fear. He deliberately allowed some captured soldiers and townsfolk to escape, knowing they would spread tales of Mongol speed, precision, and ruthlessness. This psychological warfare often broke enemy morale before a single arrow was loosed. The Jin military response was fragmented. Local commanders, cut off from central authority, acted independently. Some fortified their cities and prepared for long sieges, while others abandoned their posts entirely, melting away into the countryside. A few sought to strike at the Mongol supply lines, but their efforts were met with swift and brutal retaliation. One notable example was the city of Yongsheng, a prosperous trade hub to the southeast of Shangyang. Upon hearing of Shangyang's fall, the city's governor ordered the gates barred and the walls strengthened. However, his garrison was small and poorly trained. When Mongol scouts appeared on the horizon, the merchants and nobles inside the city began pressuring the governor to surrender, fearing destruction of their wealth. The standoff ended without a battle. Yongsheng opened its gates and the Mongols entered unopposed.
The ease with which cities now fell emboldened Temujin's commanders. They began advancing on multiple fronts, using the rivers and flatlands to move troops quickly between targets. While one force besieged a walled city, another would sweep through the surrounding countryside, destroying granaries and capturing livestock. This two-pronged strategy starved the cities and cut off any hope of reinforcement. The emperor, finally shaken into action, called for the consolidation of his armies in the southern capital. Messengers were sent to every corner of the empire, ordering generals to abandon their isolated positions and march toward the city. But these orders came too late. Many of the intended reinforcements never arrived, either intercepted by Mongol patrols or refusing to march at all. By the end of the season, the Mongols had seized several key river crossings and trading towns. The Jin economy began to collapse as taxes went uncollected and trade routes were severed. Even loyalists within the court began to question whether the dynasty could survive another year of war. For Temujin, this was the moment he had been preparing for. The enemy was divided, their morale shattered, and their resources dwindling. Ahead lay the greatest prize of the southern campaign, the imperial capital itself. The Jin imperial capital, Zhongdu, was a jewel of the empire. Its sprawling markets, towering walls, and grand palaces were a testament to centuries of wealth and power. For Temujin, capturing this city was not only a strategic goal, but a symbolic act that would crush the heart of his enemy. From the moment his scouts confirmed the capital's defenses, Temujin began planning a siege unlike any before. He summoned his most experienced generals, Subutai, Jebe, and Mukali, and laid out the strategy on a large map spread across a table in his command tent. The plan was simple in its objective, but complex in execution. Surround the city completely. Sever every road and river leading to it, and wait until the defenders were too weak to resist. The first step was to assemble the largest Mongol force yet seen in the southern campaign. Messengers rode to every newly conquered city, ordering fresh levies of soldiers, engineers, and craftsmen to join the siege. Blacksmiths worked day and night forging arrowheads, spear tips, and siege engine parts. Carpenters shaped beams for towering siege ladders and massive rams. Entire forests were felled to fuel the construction. Meanwhile, the Mongols established a network of forward camps stretching in a wide arc around Zhongdu. Each camp was carefully positioned near water sources and defended by earthworks and palisades. Patrols on horseback ensured no messenger or supply convoy could enter or leave the city.
Inside Zhongdu, the Jin emperor ordered the gates sealed and the walls manned at all hours. Thousands of soldiers were stationed along the battlements, their armor gleaming under the sun. Archers trained relentlessly, while engineers prepared counter-siege weapons, catapults, ballistae, and pots of boiling oil. The city's granaries were stocked, and wells were checked to ensure water supplies would last. Yet, even as preparations were made, morale in the capital was uncertain. The news from Xiangyang and Yongchang had spread fear, and rumors of Mongol cruelty circulated in the markets. Some merchants began hoarding goods, driving prices higher, while poorer families quietly discussed fleeing before the siege began. Temujin's forces advanced steadily, tightening the noose. Subutai led a lightning raid to the east, capturing the last major supply hub feeding Zhongdu. Jebe took a cavalry column north, seizing river barges and sinking others to prevent their use. By the time the Mongols were ready to begin the siege in earnest, the capital was already isolated. The Mongol engineers then began constructing enormous siege towers, taller than any they had built before. Covered in wet hides to resist fire, these towers would allow archers to shoot directly into the city streets. Alongside them, trebuchets capable of hurling stones weighing hundreds of pounds were assembled. Some engines were even designed to launch rotting animal carcasses and burning pitch over the walls, a grim form of biological warfare meant to spread disease and terror.
Temujin himself rode along the siege lines, speaking to his warriors. He reminded them that this city represented the pride of the Jin, and its fall would echo across the world. His words carried a promise. Those who fought well would share in the spoils, from gold and silk to the finest horses and armor. By the time the first snow of the season began to fall, the Mongol siege ring was complete. Fires burned in the camps, the sound of hammers and saws filling the air as the final preparations were made. Inside Zhongdu, the defenders braced for the storm they knew was coming. The stage was set for one of the most brutal and decisive sieges in the history of the Mongol conquests. At dawn, the winter sky above Zhongdu glowed faintly with pale light, but the air was already filled with the distant rumble of drums. From the walls of the city, defenders saw the horizon darken, not from clouds, but from the movement of tens of thousands of Mongol warriors advancing in disciplined formations. Siege towers creaked forward on massive wheels. Trebuchets stood ready like giants at rest, and lines of archers moved into position. The attack began with a deafening roar. Mongol war drums pounded in unison, their rhythm matched by the thudding of trebuchet arms launching stones the size of millstones. They crashed into Zhongdu's outer walls, sending shards of brick and dust into the air. At the same time, smaller catapults hurled flaming pitch, splattering the battlements in bursts of fire. Jin defenders scrambled to douse the flames with buckets of water and sand, shouting orders above the chaos. Archers on both sides joined the deadly exchange. Mongol bowmen loosed clouds of arrows in rapid volleys, their composite bows sending shafts over remarkable distances. From the walls, Jin archers returned fire, targeting siege crews and cavalry officers. The hiss of arrows, the crash of stone, and the cries of the wounded blended into a terrible symphony of battle.
Temujin, positioned on a hill overlooking the battlefield, watched with a calm intensity. He issued orders to press the attack on 3 fronts simultaneously, keeping the defenders too occupied to concentrate their forces. Subutai led the western assault, pushing siege towers close to the walls, while Jebe directed the eastern flank, using covered rams to batter the gates. Mukali commanded the central force, launching relentless trebuchet fire to weaken the wall sections. By midday, the Mongols had breached one section of the outer wall, but the defenders fought fiercely to hold the gap. Spears and pikes bristled as Jin infantry clashed with Mongol warriors who surged through the breach. The fighting devolved into brutal hand-to-hand combat, with neither side yielding ground easily. In the afternoon, Temujin unleashed a psychological weapon he had long prepared. Using the trebuchets, his forces hurled not only stones, but also the decaying bodies of animals and prisoners over the walls. The stench was overwhelming, and panic rippled through the civilian population. Though the defenders tried to maintain discipline, the morale of both soldiers and citizens began to falter. As night fell, the Mongols did not withdraw completely. Instead, they lit hundreds of campfires around the city, their glow forming a fiery ring visible from every tower of Zhongdu. The message was clear. There would be no respite, no escape. Mongol war horns sounded intermittently through the night, denying the defenders sleep. Inside the city, the Emperor's council debated whether to attempt a breakout, send envoys to negotiate, or continue the fight. Supplies were still holding, but the strain was beginning to show. Food distribution had to be rationed, and rumors of desertion among the troops began to spread. Temujin knew the siege would not end in a single day, but with the walls already damaged, supplies dwindling, and fear spreading, time was firmly on his side. The first day of the great siege of Zhongdu had ended, but for the defenders, the nightmare had only just begun. The third month of the siege brought no relief for Zhongdu. The once proud capital now lay beneath a pall of smoke, its markets silent, its streets choked with rubble. Hunger had begun to stalk the city. Horses were slaughtered for food, and desperate citizens boiled leather from old armor to make broth. Disease, carried by the rotting carcasses hurled over the walls, spread quickly. Temujin knew the defenders were weakening. He ordered his forces to prepare for a decisive assault, one that would leave no doubt of Mongol supremacy. Before dawn, the siege lines stirred to life. Siege towers and ladders were dragged into place under cover of darkness. Trebuchets, already loaded, awaited the signal. Warriors whispered final prayers and tightened their armor straps. At the first light of day, a deep blast from the war horns cut through the cold air. The trebuchets released in unison, hurling massive stones and flaming pitch against the walls. Siege towers rolled forward, their hides slick with water to repel fire arrows. Covered rams smashed into the city gates with thunderous blows. Mongol archers, advancing under shields, poured arrow fire into the battlements. A great crack echoed across the battlefield as one of the weakened wall sections gave way, collapsing into a heap of stone and dust. Through the breach surged a wave of Mongol warriors, swords flashing, shields up. The defenders, exhausted and malnourished, fought with desperate courage, but the sheer momentum of the Mongol assault was unstoppable.
Subutai's forces poured through the breach from the west, while Jibei's cavalry circled to strike the defenders from behind. Mukhali's troops stormed the gates, finally splintering them after hours of relentless pounding. The streets of Zhongdu became a battlefield, with mounted archers galloping down narrow lanes and foot soldiers clearing buildings one by one. The emperor's palace became the final stronghold. Imperial guards formed tight ranks at the gates, their ornate armor gleaming even in the haze of smoke. Temujin's elite guard advanced in disciplined formation, shields locked, cutting their way through the defenders. After hours of brutal fighting, the palace gates fell. The emperor, faced with inevitable capture, sent envoys to sue for peace. Temujin accepted the surrender, but the terms were harsh. All weapons were to be surrendered, and the city's wealth was to be turned over to the Mongols. Many nobles were executed, and craftsmen, scholars, and skilled workers were taken north to serve the empire. When the Mongol banners were raised over the city, a silence fell across the smoldering streets. Zhongdu, once the beating heart of the Jin dynasty, now belonged to Temujin. The conquest sent shockwaves through the region, and the legend of Genghis Khan's invincibility grew. The fall of Zhongdu was not just a military victory, it was a statement to the world. The Mongol Empire had shown that no wall was too high, no city too strong, and no ruler beyond its reach. With the fall of Zhongdu, the Jin dynasty's heartland lay open to Mongol control. Temujin's victory had been more than a feat of arms. It was a demonstration of strategy, discipline, and the relentless will that defined his rise. Yet for the Khan, the capture of the city was not the end of his ambition. It was merely another step in a far greater journey. In the months following the surrender,
the Mongols reorganized the city. Skilled artisans were relocated to Karakoram, the growing capital of Temujin's empire. Scholars and scribes were put to work copying texts and mapping the conquered lands. The remaining population of Zhongdu was heavily taxed, their wealth funneled into the Mongol war machine. The markets slowly reopened under the watch of Mongol guards, and life, though forever changed, began to resume its rhythm. Temujin spent the winter consolidating his rule. His generals, Subutai, Jebe, and Mukali, were rewarded with new titles and lands, their loyalty strengthened through both wealth and honor. Reports arrived from across the empire. New territories in the north had submitted, and trade along the Silk Road was booming under Mongol protection. But there were also fresh challenges. The Western Shah had grown restless, and the Khwarezmian Empire to the west presented both opportunity and danger.
In the evenings, Temujin would meet with his closest advisors in the great tent that served as his mobile court. Maps were unrolled, showing rivers, deserts, and mountains far beyond the horizon. His gaze often wandered toward the west, as if already seeing the cities yet to be taken. An empire, he would say, must keep moving or it dies. We are like the wind. If we stop, we disappear. Despite his focus on future conquests, Temujin understood the importance of ruling wisely. He issued laws to protect trade caravans, ensure fair taxation, and punish theft severely. These decrees, compiled into what became known as the Yasa, helped maintain order across a rapidly expanding empire. The Khan's rule was harsh, but it was also just, in a way that won him the loyalty of many conquered peoples. In the spring, the army departed Zhongdu. The city was left under the command of a trusted governor, with a garrison large enough to deter rebellion. The departure was marked by a display of Mongol discipline, rows of horsemen moving in perfect formation, banners fluttering in the wind. For the citizens of Zhongdu, it was a reminder that although the storm had passed, the shadow of the Khan would never fully leave. As the Mongols moved northward, tales of their victories spread far and wide. Merchants in Samarkand whispered of the fall of Zhongdu, and envoys from distant kingdoms came to Karakoram to seek alliances or to plead for mercy. The name Genghis Khan had become a force in itself, inspiring fear, respect, and awe in equal measure.
Years later, veterans of the siege would recount their memories of those months. They spoke of the endless drums that shook the air, the smoke that blotted out the sun, and the moment the city's walls crumbled. They remembered Temujin's calm presence amid the chaos, his ability to read the battlefield like a book. To them, the fall of Zhongdu was the moment the Mongol Empire truly began to dominate the world stage. Temujin's campaigns would continue, reaching from the shores of the Pacific to the edges of Europe. But the siege of Zhongdu remained one of his most celebrated victories, a turning point that cemented his reputation as one of history's greatest conquerors. For the people of Zhongdu, the memory of the siege never faded. The rebuilt walls stood as silent witnesses to a time when the earth shook beneath the hooves of thousands, when fire and stone rained from the sky, and when a single man's vision redrew the map of the known world. And so, the story of Genghis Khan and the fall of Zhongdu passed into legend, told and retold across generations. It became a tale not just of war, but of ambition, endurance, and the unyielding march of history. A story that begins in the vast steppes of Mongolia and echoes through time to this day.